Okay, I did one before with Lost Worlds, and I'm doing it again here. It's sort of a quick hit of a video on the game 4000 AD. This is probably more along the lines of the standard reviews you see, but I don't want to do a solitary playthrough. I just got done playing the game. I wanted to touch on kind of what the rules are about and the game is about, as well as some thoughts on it. And I figured it would be cool to do this because I'm not going to be able to do it solo very easily. Alright, so this is a space conquest game, and there's a couple different scenarios in it. In the scenarios, basically, one of them's the alliance game, where you play with one side, Pavo and Antares versus Regulus and Algol. And the goal of that game is to wipe out, capture the other players or the other alliances' two home systems. I play with a slightly modified version of it when playing in two. In the two-player game, you're supposed to play the two alliances, the two portions of each alliance completely separate from each other. That gets really confusing in large part because although the green pieces are divided into two colors rather nicely, the red ones are not. There's a slight difference in the shade, but my little eyes don't work. It looks actually better on the camera than it does in real life. My eyes are having a really hard time telling them apart. Okay, so this is sort of a three-dimensional map, not terribly so. You have sectors laid out in a grid, and then you have red and yellow. And yellow is considered to be above red, one full sector space above red, which will affect some of the, well, it affects the movement costs from one location to another. All right. When you play the game, well, at the beginning of the game, and I'm only going to touch on the one scenario that I played, there's also the independent scenario, which is a 3 or 4 player game. It's very similar to the other one, except that you have sort of this diplomacy aspect to the game, which probably makes it a better game, actually. Okay, so at the beginning of the game, you have 15 spaceships around each home planet, and these guys count as 5s, and the little guys count as 1s, and you just kind of spread them around your home planet to indicate how many troops are there. You determine somehow which player is going to go first, and you need a coin for this game, which is going to determine whether something's a production turn or not. The first turn is sort of a production turn, and then every other turn is also. So on the first turn, it's a production turn in the sense that it counts as one, but you don't actually produce. Second turn will not be one. Third turn will be, and so on, with every odd turn being a production turn. Okay. Each player in turn can do a launch from one of his alliance factions onto this track, which is the hyperspace track. And he does this by putting some ships into the little hyperspace disk, marking the planet that he's coming from. And there are 2 planets with the same location, essentially. But that's not a big deal. You can only launch from one planet, but you mark it by the general location and distance. So this is going to be A, yellow. And this is the A sector, and we go all the way up until we hit the L sector. And then you shift the ship forward one space into hyperspace. And immediately you could land it. You could land it on, say, the other A. This is one space away, which is marked with the 1 space. Later on in the game, as you move forward, and we'll hit that later, you'll be able to land on different planets. So 2 away would be 1, 2, or 1, 2, or 1, 2 up to the red zone. And that's how you do all the counting in the game. The furthest distance away is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then up to 7. That's why the hyperspace track only goes to 7. Okay, let's go a little bit into the sequence of play. So the first thing, if it's a production turn, and it's not the first turn of the game, you collect production. And production is collected by collecting combinations of O's and plus signs. If you have ships on a planet and you have either an O, a plus sign, or a combination, you count the O's and pluses that you have. And for every pair of O's and pluses you have, you can build one new ship at your home world. Now in my little variant, there's 2 home worlds under 1 player, essentially. Not two alliances, not two allied factions under 1 player, but they're really considered 1 faction. I think it's easier to cope with that way. And it makes the game maybe harder to win, but easier to play. Alright, so the first thing you do is you collect that and you put your ships at your home world. The second thing you do is all your hyperspace disks that are on the board, on the track, move forward 1 space. And now they have an option to land. And they can land anywhere. You didn't have to decide where you were going particularly. You probably had a good idea. But they can land anywhere within the range that they're at. If they're at range 7 and they have to move, they fall off the board and disappear. They've gone beyond the range of the known galaxy. And actually, I don't think that's handled in the rules, but it's the only way to make the game make any sense. Because it is possible you could not have landed if you were on the 7 space. Or it's possible that you've flown past the known range of the galaxy. So for example, if you're at Sol, the furthest distance is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away. So if you hit any number above 5 on the hyperspace channel, you've already thrown yourself out of this galaxy. Alright, so after you've moved these forward 1 space, you're allowed to land them. And you're allowed to land them at the distance that they are, and exactly at that distance. You can't go shorter. So for example, from here, I'd look at the A, yellow, and I'd say, okay, 2, 1, 2, I could land here, or 1, 2 here, or 1, 2 here. Okay, I'll wait. And maybe on my next turn I move 3. And here's something kind of cool. 1, 2, 3. This is a planet with an O and a plus. It's going to produce a ship on its own, so I can land there. Because it's empty, that's no problem. If I'm landing on a place where there's enemy ships, the only restriction here is I have to land with more ships than the enemy has. In this case, I couldn't do that. I have the same number, or if I had less, I couldn't do it. But let's say I had some quantity more. Well, then a battle occurs. And the way a battle occurs is you just land there, and the enemy's destroyed, and you take no losses. Bang. That means whoever's got the biggest ships kind of floating around in the air has a lot of power. Because if you have the most ships in your fleet, you can pretty much take out whatever you're flying by. But you kind of have to worry because somebody else could have just slightly more than you. They see what you launched, they launch 1 ship more wherever you land. Maybe they can find a way to land there more quickly. Or at the right time. And after you land, that's when you do the launches, okay? And you're allowed to launch only 1 fleet on each track that you have. And a track is usually assigned to a particular faction. In my version of the game, you have 2 tracks, and you can actually launch, without regard to faction, 2 different fleets on them. When you launch, I've already explained this, you check where you're launching from, and in this case, if I was launching from here, I would grab a red marker, because this is red, and I'd put it in the D slot. And I can put as many ships from 1 planet as I like into there, and then it slides up into the 1 box. Okay, a launch like that takes up my 1 disk that I'm allowed to launch per turn. And I can still land that immediately, so I could land that here, because that's a distance of 1 away, as is the planet itself. And all I've really done there is I've lost my ability to launch a fleet that's going to be in the air for a while. So the way this ends up playing out is initially a grab for all these especially the O plus combination things, but for the productive planets. And then you hit a point where somebody's able to start hitting other people's productive planets and taking their ships away. And then it becomes sort of a war of attrition between the production and the ability to smack large quantities of someone else's ships. And you can land a fleet that maybe would die and then kill an opponent's smaller fleet and then jump back up into space where you're safe again because you can't fight in space itself. Let me talk a little bit about it as a regular review in a moment. I think I've covered most of the rules. Victory conditions: take the opponent's home planets. That's all there is to it. All right, I'll be back in a moment. So this is land 4000 or 4000 AD, depending on how you want to use either the French pronunciation, words, whatever, or the English. I always just knew it as land because it was such an odd game. Okay. Now, an interesting sort of history with this. This is something my father picked up for me from a flea market long, long ago. A tag sale or something. And it intrigued me. You know, the theme. It's a space game, right? Before I had really gotten into war games, and it was an interesting thing to play around with, but obviously a pure strategy game. And later, as I got older and wanted to show people kind of more interesting games that I had that weren't just, you know, these strongly tied to a theme, more like a war game or a simulation or whatever, this was something that I really wanted to bring up, and I brought it up to Buffalo. Played it with a few people. Everybody was very much astounded by the one thing that kind of entranced me about it, which is the, you know, when you set out on these hyperspace tables, you don't know where you're going necessarily. You have a plan. Hey, I can hit this planet in 3 turns. That'll be cool. You can combine your ships and attacks so that it's hard to tell just what's attacking, what the actual attack is, because there's like 2 fleets out there that could both land at the same place at the same time, so that you have this kind of conjunction planned in your mind. But then things change, and as the game changes, as the situation unfolds, you might end up flying off in a completely different direction than what you thought you were going in. And that's just, it's so wacky and so weird that it completely entranced me to this game for whatever reason. And that's probably the most exciting thing about it. The actual play of the game, I've noticed a horrible tendency, and actually surprisingly even in 3 players, for the thing to stagnate. With players who are at about equal experience with the game and capability, it's very, very difficult to break the other player. Whatever advantage you're gaining in this attrition war, they can probably gain one on their own. I don't think that my option terribly changes that, although maybe, and I'm not sure of this, maybe one of the allies is wiped out when his homeworld goes. That's not my understanding, though. My understanding is that they get to fight on under the base rules. So, you know, it's really quite similar. It's just a matter of having to divide your forces a little bit more rigorously by color alignments. And the red color alignment is so poorly distinguished in the playing pieces, at least from my eyes. But as far as I know, I'm not colorblind or anything. That it becomes very, very difficult to sort those pieces, and they're not in boxes. If they had been more easily distinguished, I would be much more in favor of playing it by the rules as they stand. It's an intriguing game. It's really exciting to you know, play around with it for a little bit, but I don't think it catches you. You know, I mean, it's almost a chess-like game or a Go-like game, more like a chess game because of the surprise factor. You're really sneaking up on the opponent and trying to waylay him in the same way that I think of chess. But while it's a game of that nature, it probably doesn't, it just doesn't have the same kind of hook that something like Chess or Go does. It's not quite as simple, and it's not, it certainly doesn't have the thousands of year history that, say, Go does. And chess is not all that much further behind. I think they put it at 700 AD, but that's not really chess by that point, at that time. There were dice and stuff involved. So while this is interesting, it also doesn't have, even closely matched players in chess or Go tend to see a victory happen. Something where it's very difficult to achieve victory at all, where the game just drags on for hours and hours, conceivably, in this kind of deadly stalemate. Well, that's not going to be too thrilling, and that's where I'm afraid this actually holds. I haven't played enough of it to really speak authoritatively on that, but I think that is the flaw to it, because a couple of times when I have played against someone who had a feel for it, and really maybe had played it before or whatever, that's what it degenerated into. Neither of us could get a grasp on the other person, really. Once you do get a production advantage, though, once you do get a significant increase in production over the other player, that sort of snowballs pretty quickly. It's still kind of a pain to take them out in the final blow, but it certainly becomes quite possible. The problem is when production's within a point or two of each other, they can still put enough of a force out there that it's hard to roll them over and finish them off easily. Anyway, that's some words I have on this 4000 AD. I'm very happy. I mean, I lost my copy in Buffalo and spent money to pick up a used kind of beat up copy, and spent the mailing cost as well, which, I think indicates this is something I felt I really wanted in my collection. Even if it's not going to be a favorite of mine, even if it's not going to get a lot of play time, there's something so weird about this game that I really, really felt this hole in my collection not having it anymore, even if it's not a really popular game or whatever. Okay.